listener production.
Hello and welcome to The Briefing. Katrina Blau is with you. Happy Friday, everyone. North Korea has launched a series of garbage balloons over the border into South Korea. So these are hundreds of balloons packed with dirty scrap paper, cigarette butts, even manure. Pyongyang says it's in response to Seoul distributing anti-North propaganda leaflets into cities and towns across the north.
They engage in these sort of seemingly innocuous but really annoying provocations to each other, basically as a way of sort of expressing sort of that they disapprove what the other side is doing without actually escalating to a full-scale war.
In this episode of The Briefing, we're taking a deep dive on why these garbage balloons were launched and whether it means a ramp-up in hostilities. That's coming up shortly, but first, Helen Smith is here with the headlines. It is Friday, June 7.
Morning, Katrina. Some major world leaders have come together with the Ukraine president to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day on the beaches of Normandy. King Charles, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, French President Emmanuel Macron, Prince William and US President Joe Biden were among those who participated in the D-Day commemoration. It was the first overseas trip for King Charles since his cancer diagnosis was announced in February.
It is with the most profound sense of gratitude that we remember them and all those who served at that critical time.
Yeah, good to see Charles out and about again. This newly completed British Normandy Memorial overlooks the beaches where Allied troops landed 80 years ago. Around 4,500 soldiers were killed. US President Joe Biden telling a D-Day anniversary event that we will not walk away from Ukraine's defence, urging Western and NATO allies to recapture the spirit of D-Day, saying if they don't, it will allow Ukraine to be subjugated and Russia to threaten more of Europe. Well, here's a pretty interesting story. Channel 9 chairman and former federal treasurer Peter Costello has denied assaulting a News Limited journalist at Canberra Airport. The Australian newspaper has posted footage of this alleged incident, which appears to show Mr. Costello walking with purpose towards reporter Liam Mendes, who was asking him questions, and then Mr. Mendes falls backwards. Here's some of their exchange from yesterday.
Well, you've got to answer the questions, Mr. Costello. Don't. You've just assaulted me. Mr. Costello, you can't do that. That's all captured on camera.
Yeah, in response to that, Mr. Costello says the reporter fell over an advertising placard while walking backwards. And the questions that Mr. Costello was being asked were ones about Nine's recent revelations of sexual harassment and bullying in the organisation.
Yeah, those pesky advertising placards, Helen, they're the worst, aren't they? Look, presumably we were talking about this morning because we both looked at the video. And if you're interested in this story, I really strongly advise you take a look. We were saying, look, this video only shows it from the journalist's perspective. It's presumably taken on his phone, but there would have been CCTV cameras around the airport, so surely this can be cleared up.
Yeah, look, I'm sure it will come out. I'm sure we'll get more footage of other angles and, yeah, we'll see what the incident was all about. Israel is being accused of a horrific massacre following the deaths of at least 33 people at a Gaza school, including 23 women and children. The school that was struck with 2 missiles was run by a United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, where classrooms were filled with hundreds of displaced people who had fled Israeli offences and bombardment in northern Gaza. The IDF says it was targeting a Hamas compound inside the building.
Yeah, so the military hasn't immediately offered evidence of this, which, of course, people are going to be wanting. It did release a photo of the school pointing to classrooms on the 2nd and 3rd floor where it claimed dozens of militants were located and said that it tried to reduce the risk to civilians before the strike. The US is continuing to back a phased ceasefire and hostage release, which was outlined by President Joe Biden last week. As to how Israel is currently responding to that, it says it won't end the war without destroying Hamas, while Hamas is demanding a ceasefire and full withdrawal of Israeli forces. And Elon Musk's SpaceX has had a big win. It's recorded its first successful test flight after 4 attempts. The giant Starship rocket survived a re-entry through Earth's atmosphere, splashing down in the Indian Ocean after launching from South Texas. A live stream of this landing showed the rocket with missing tiles and damaged flaps, but Elon Musk is pretty happy about all this, posting on his social media platform X that the Starship made it all the way to a soft landing in the ocean. This is a pretty big deal, Helen, because in the previous attempt, which was back in March, the spaceship blew up just short of its landing goal. So after quite a few attempts, it wasn't looking too good for Elon Musk's SpaceX Starship program, which is designed to be fully reusable. So hopefully some of those pieces from the last attempt would have been reused. You'd hope so.
Now, here's some fun facts about the rocket. It's a 2-stage spacecraft, and it's the world's largest rocket at 121 metres tall. And SpaceX is also already selling tourist trips around the moon. But the ultimate goal of Elon Musk is to send fleets of starships into space, launching people and infrastructure that's necessary to build a city on Mars.
Look, you got to have big dreams, right? I'm not sure that based on, what are we, a strike rate of 1 out of 5 so far that's gone well, that I'd be signing up. But, you never know. All right, Helen, thank you so much for joining us for the headlines. We are now going to get into our briefing topic on this campaign of garbage balloons launched by North Korea and whether it's an act of war. North Korea has been sending hundreds of balloons full of garbage over the border into South Korea. Now, early reports suggested this was manure in the balloons, which is pretty gross. It now appears to be, yes, that is right, but it's also waste paper, cigarette butts and general garbage. I really wondered what the motivation was behind this campaign when I heard about it. Is it a sign that tensions are rising on the Korean peninsula? More frighteningly, what could South Korea now do to retaliate? Joining us to talk us through the answers is Justin Hastings, who's a Professor of International Relations at the University of Sydney. Professor Hastings, thank you for joining us on the briefing. Firstly, there were some early reports, as we mentioned, that the balloons were carrying manure. What do we know about the initial stages of North Korea's balloon campaign?
So there was a concern initially that the balloons, because they carry manure and other waste, might contain biohazards. So South Korea sort of released biohazard response teams to clean them up, just to make sure there was nothing that was actually dangerous in the balloons. They did contain manure, they contained trash, they contained scraps of paper, scraps of clothing, things like that. Basically things that had to be cleaned up that, might be too dirty to sort of touch by yourself. That was the initial claim. Weirdly, sort of examining North Korea's waste is a good way to understand, what the conditions are like in North Korea. So in some sense, North Korea might have given a little bit of an intelligence boost as a result.
So we don't know yet whether it was human excrement or animal excrement. I guess we may never know from the West, but we'll just wait and see.
Yeah, I mean, the words they used to describe it was manure. So it was probably sort of animal excrement. But, I guess that's something for science to discover when they're actually examining the waste.
And when I first heard this story, I kind of laughed, to be honest, because it just sounds so petty and childish. What has led to all of this happening?
I think you have to understand the larger context, which is that North Korea and South Korea are still technically at war. And it's not like there's a peace. It's actually a very tense situation in general on the DMZ, which despite its name is the most militarized border in the world. For North Korea and South Korea, the question is always, what can they do to express their sentiments about the other side without actually starting the war all over again? So they engage in these sort of seemingly innocuous but really annoying sort of provocations to each other, basically as a way of sort of expressing sort of that they disapprove of what the other side is doing without actually escalating to a full-scale war. So that's why it seems petty. It's just a way to actually sort of make sure you don't get into a war, but sort of express that you're actually still, you're definitely not, in a state of peace.
Yeah, sending balloons filled with garbage or carrying garbage over the border, it seems, as you say, like a niggling thing that siblings would even do to annoy each other. But this has been part of a broader campaign or a broader state of escalations between North and South Korea. Can you just describe for us some of what's been going on lately?
I think you should go back a couple of years. So in 2018, the then South Korean president and North Korea were in a state of somewhat of detente, and they sort of established an agreement whereby they basically wouldn't provoke each other across the DMZ. And sort of what this meant in practice was that they stopped large-scale exercises in the DMZ. They sort of stood down some weapons systems, they stood down some exercises, and they stopped the propaganda broadcasts. North Korea also has loudspeakers. So it's not just South Korea, but North Korea is particularly annoyed by the South Korean loudspeakers and the South Korean sort of propaganda and sort of leaflet drops because, from North Korea's perspective, the information that comes in is much more dangerous than whatever information comes out of North Korea into South Korea. This is the agreement they had. That agreement has gradually broken down over time for several reasons. Basically, sort of in South Korea, the law banning propaganda droplets and loudspeakers was struck down as an infringement on freedom of expression because South Korea is a democracy. And in North Korea's case, they started attempting to launch spy satellites, right? And which they eventually did. So North Korea had a lot of missile tests, a lot of sort of rocket tests, all of which were in contravention of UN sanctions, which led ultimately to the launch of a spy satellite, but also South Korea withdrawing some of its actions about that agreement. That, in fact, is we're seeing propaganda drops and leaflet drops again from South Korea is why North Korea initiated this latest round of sort of weather balloon escalation.
What do you think is in some of those propaganda leaflets? Do we know what they say?
Generally, they're information sort of about the outside world. They're information that denounces Kim Jong-un especially. A lot of the propaganda leaflets from South Korea are actually by North Korean defectors. They, in particular, have a sense not only of what North Korea believes is dangerous information, but also they have a particular animus towards Kim Jong-un himself, right? So in that sense, you can probably understand what it's about. K-pop songs may seem sort of weird, bizarre, maybe to the outside world, but you have to understand that South Korean culture is one of the biggest draws for North Koreans to listen to and to sort of interact with surreptitiously. South Korean culture, and especially sort of some Western ideas, are things that North Korea really, really wants to keep out more than any other information. So from that perspective, the propaganda is basically zeroing in on what North Korea itself believes to be the most dangerous aspects of information that might come in from the outside world.
Because again, when I heard that South Korea blasts K-pop songs on those speakers over the border, well, that also sounds ridiculous and petty. But as you mentioned, if North Korea is cutting off internet access and access to world news and broader culture to its citizens, could that be seen as quite inflammatory?
Yeah, I mean, so North Korea's internet doesn't actually connect to the outside world, outside of very specific portals that the government controls. So in theory, I mean, the North Korean population really only has access to, the radio stations that operate inside North Korea, to the news media inside of North Korea. The phones that North Koreans use, in theory, are not capable of talking outside of the country. They're only intra-North Korea. So to have sort of a situation where South Korea is essentially sort of broadcasting culture and information the North Korean government doesn't want is really sort of provocative in a way that I don't think we would understand sort of any other two countries interacting.
Let's get back to the garbage balloons now, and hundreds of them have come across the border already. I believe that tactic has now been paused, but in terms of what we can expect going forward, South Korea has said, look, if any more of these balloons come over, we are going to retaliate in a way that is unbearable, quote unquote. That word sounds frightening. What do you think we can expect here? Well,
so you have to understand, I mean, in some sense, the main development in response to North Korea's balloons was not sort of the threat of unendurable consequences. It was that South Korea suspended the rest of the 2018 agreement, right? And what this means in practice, although they haven't actually started it yet, is that South Korea no longer feels bound by the parts of the agreement that would minimize large-scale exercises at the border and that would stop the sort of the propaganda broadcasts and the leaflet drops. And so what that means is that if South Korea does follow through on their suspension, that they would start large-scale exercises, military exercises, shooting exercises at the border, and that they would start broadcasting again, right? And so in this sense, whether North Korea decides that that's something that requires retaliation is a separate question. But that's sort of what South Korea means. Beyond that, what they would do, I mean, who knows? But once you sort of abrogated the agreement, there's a range of options, some of which can be quite aggressive, that South Korea could use to retaliate against North Korea, sort of actions like this.
And in terms of what we in the rest of the world can take as sort of that canary in the coal mine for things getting really out of hand, what would be some of the things that you think would be a worrying indicator?
We can think about sort of North Korean provocations that could get out of hand are ones where one side or the other actually engages in activities that actually result in people dying, right? So, so we strongly suspect, for example, that North Korea torpedoed a ship, a South Korean Navy ship in 2010, which resulted in a number of people dying. North Korea shelled sort of South Korean island, which resulted in some people dying. I mean, these are sort of provocations that really are sort of could drive you to the brink of some larger conflict. Sort of the balloons are sort of just a back and forth, right? They're sort of a weird way to do it, but it's North Korea's way of basically expressing dissent without actually sort of launching an attack that could kill people. But that's something they could do. Sort of the only, I think, silver lining on this is that, they've been at this for, a long time, for 75 years. They know how to escalate without actually getting to a full-scale war, right? In a way that sort of I think many other countries aren't. And so, we can sort of decide that both of these countries are going to very carefully calibrate what they do and sort of to do what they think will deter the other side and do what they think will sort of satisfy their own populations that they're acting strongly against the provocations from the other side.
Well, as you say, I mean, balloons attached to manure, it is the ultimate in dirty tactics, but hopefully not going to kill anyone. Professor Hastings, thank you so much for your time and for your insight.
Thank you.
That was Professor Justin Hastings from the University of Sydney. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Briefing. The team will be back in your feed from 3 this afternoon. I'm Katrina Blowers. I will catch you later.
Listener.